In 2012, a Reddit user named Temptatosoon shared a story that would shake thousands of readers to their core. It started with a flash, not of light, but of awareness. A young man opens his eyes in a life he's sure is his. There's a woman beside him. Her voice feels familiar. The warmth of morning sunlight, the smell of coffee, a daughter's laughter echoing from the next room. He's happy. For 10 years, he builds a life, love, family, work, memories, every moment as vivid as this one. Until one evening, something breaks. A lamp in his living room looks wrong. The light bends around it in impossible ways. He stares at it for 3 days straight, and then the world begins to unravel. The lamp isn't real. My wife, my children, none of this is real. The room dissolves in red light, screams, pain. When he finally opens his eyes again, he's on the pavement, surrounded by strangers, his body broken, blood in his mouth. The last thing he remembers, the moment a football player's fist hit his face. 7 minutes unconscious. 10 years of another life. But here's the question that still haunts him. Which world was real? The one he woke into, or the one he left behind? But what if the truth is that both were real? And what if every night when you fall asleep, you don't drift into fantasy, you wake up somewhere else? What if the life you call real is just one of your many days, lived across countless worlds, by countless versions of you? You ever wake up, go through your entire morning routine, shower, coffee, checking your phone, and then actually wake up? It's called a false awakening, and if you've experienced it, you know the feeling. Everything seemed normal. Everything felt real, until it wasn't. Here's what's strange. During false awakenings, you're not confused. You're not flying or talking to dead relatives or experiencing typical dream weirdness. You're living your normal life with complete logical coherence. The coffee tastes right. Your thoughts are linear. You remember yesterday clearly. The only tells are subtle wrongnesses, a clock that won't display the correct time, a light switch that does nothing, text in a book that keeps changing when you look away. But here's what disturbs researchers. In sleep laboratories, when they wake people during these false awakenings and analyze their brain activity, they find something that shouldn't be possible. The brain isn't in waking consciousness, but it's not in typical dream states either. It's both, simultaneously. The readings show theta waves, the signature of dreaming, mixed with bursts of alpha rhythm, the pattern of wakefulness. Your brain is awake inside the dream, conscious inside unconsciousness. And here's where it gets interesting. These hybrid states cluster together. If you experience false awakenings, you're statistically more likely to also experience lucid dreaming, sleep paralysis, out-of-body experiences, as if there's a spectrum of consciousness where sleep and waking aren't opposites, but overlapping territories. A place where you can be simultaneously dead and alive, dreaming and awake, here and somewhere else. Maybe false awakenings aren't errors in perception at all. Maybe they're glimpses, moments when the barrier between timelines thins just enough for awareness to slip through. Think about it. If your brain can be awake inside a dream, maybe reality itself isn't a binary state. Maybe it's a spectrum. And what we call waking up is simply shifting frequency, moving from one branch of existence to another. Let's talk about something you don't often hear. In 1957, physicist Hugh Everett proposed the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. Every quantum event causes reality to branch into multiple parallel universes. Every decision you make, every random fluctuation, each creates a new timeline where a different outcome unfolds. You chose coffee this morning. But there's a universe where you chose tea. There's a universe where you never woke up. There's a universe where you died at birth. There's a universe where you're the president, infinite versions of you, cascading through infinite possibilities. Most people hear this and think it's theoretical, philosophical, a thought experiment for physics nerds. But here's the wild part. Physicist Max Tegmark developed a framework called quantum immortality. It proposes that your consciousness can only continue in timelines where you remain alive. Think about that. Every close call you've survived, the car that almost hit you, the illness you recovered from, that moment on the stairs when you nearly fell. Quantum immortality suggests that in countless other universes, you didn't survive. But your consciousness can't experience those timelines. You only persist in the branches where you continue to exist. Which means, from your perspective, you're functionally immortal. You'll always experience survival, because the versions of you that die can no longer sustain the branch of consciousness they once inhabited. But here's the question that changes everything. What happens to consciousness during those branching moments? Where does it go while reality splits? What if dreams are how consciousness navigates between timelines? What if sleep is when your awareness temporarily occupies other versions of yourself in parallel universes? What if you're not dreaming at night? You're waking up as another you. In the 1960s and 70s, researchers Stanley Krippner and Montague Ullman conducted experiments at Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn that produced results they couldn't explain. They were testing dream telepathy, whether one person could transmit images to someone else through dreams. The protocol was rigorous. A receiver would sleep in a monitored room, while an agent in a completely separate location focused on a randomly selected art print. The receiver would be awakened during REM sleep and asked to describe their dreams. Then independent judges, blind to which image was selected, would rate how well the dream descriptions matched each artwork. Statistically, pure chance would produce 1 match out of 6. Instead, they found consistent above-chance results. In one famous trial, the target image was Salvador Dali's The Sacrament of the Last Supper. The sleeping receiver described, "I was in a class, a seminar, an emphasis on the phrase, Sea of Galilee. A patient stretched out on the bed. The therapist was conducting a group religion. Water, a horizontal figure, a gathering of people." The correspondence was too precise to dismiss. The description wasn't literal, but symbolic. The patient on the bed could easily mirror the central figure of Christ at the table, or the translucent body hovering above the scene, a form suspended between heaven and matter. In the language of dreams, such translation through imagery is almost expected. Skeptics argued the experiments had flaws. Later attempts to replicate them produced mixed results. Some found nothing, others saw patterns that defied chance. But perhaps the inconsistency wasn't a failure of science, but a property of the phenomenon itself. Maybe consciousness doesn't behave like a fixed signal you can measure. Maybe it behaves more like a field that responds to attention, emotion, and connection. Some researchers noted correlations. When geomagnetic activity was low, when participants shared emotional resonance, the matches grew stronger. As if consciousness could stretch across the invisible boundaries that separate minds. And here's the part no one tells you. In September 2024, just months ago, a Silicon Valley startup called REM Space announced they'd achieved something that should be impossible. Two people in separate lucid dreams successfully exchanged a message. Using specially designed equipment that monitored brain activity and detected specific muscle movements, they induced lucid dreaming in both individuals and facilitated a basic communication between their dreaming minds. Which raises the uncomfortable question: if consciousness can tune into signals beyond the brain, what if it was never inside the brain to begin with? What if dreams aren't transmissions, but migrations? Temporary displacements of awareness into other coordinates of reality. Which brings us to a strange pattern emerging online. Thousands of people describing dreams that felt like entire lifetimes. There's a Reddit thread where people describe dreams that felt like entire lifetimes, not just the lamp story. Hundreds of accounts from people who closed their eyes for a night and lived years in the dream. They describe granular details. The smell of a specific brand of coffee that doesn't exist in our timeline. The layout of cities they've never visited. Conversations with people whose faces remain vivid months after waking. One person described living to old age in a dream, dying in a hospital bed, surrounded by grandchildren, and then waking up as their 25-year-old self. The emotional whiplash was so severe, they sought therapy. Because how do you mourn children who were never born? How do you grieve a spouse who never existed? But here's what separates these from normal dreams. These dreamers describe complete logical coherence, linear timelines, consistent cause and effect, years of accumulated memories that don't fade upon waking. Occasionally, something felt off, a clock showing an impossible time, a word on a page that kept rearranging itself, the faint hum of a refrigerator that stopped the moment they noticed it. Tiny fractures in what otherwise felt like perfect reality. They didn't feel like dream errors. They felt like reminders, as if something or someone was trying to tell them, "You don't belong here." It's as if consciousness, when it drifts into these other lives, isn't creating fantasy worlds at all, but visiting them. And when it starts to remember where it came from, when awareness begins to recognize itself as a visitor, the fabric starts to tear. That's what happened with the lamp. The moment when the dreaming man's consciousness, fully immersed in what felt like 10 years of ordinary life, noticed the wrongness and couldn't unsee it. Not dream logic, not flying, not symbols, just a quiet, impossible detail in an otherwise perfect world. And that's when the entire construct collapsed. Let's talk about what lies beneath those Reddit stories. Neuroscientist Stuart Hameroff and physicist Roger Penrose have proposed a theory called orchestrated objective reduction. It suggests consciousness arises from quantum processes in the brain's microtubules. If they're right, consciousness isn't generated by classical neural firing, but by quantum computation happening at the cellular level, which means consciousness itself operates according to quantum rules: superposition, entanglement, non-locality. Which means consciousness might literally exist in multiple states simultaneously. Multiple timelines, multiple versions of reality, and sleep might be when the quantum coherence that normally keeps your consciousness anchored to this timeline temporarily loosens. When you drift, when you briefly experience what it's like to be the you who made different choices, who lived different lives, who exists in parallel worlds that split from this one at every quantum decision point. Robert Lanza, a regenerative medicine researcher, has proposed something even wilder: biocentrism, the theory that consciousness creates reality rather than emerging from it. He argues that space and time aren't external facts, but constructs generated by consciousness. When you die, he suggests, your consciousness doesn't end. It simply shifts to a universe where that version of you continues to exist. It's quantum immortality from a biological perspective. And if consciousness can shift between universes at death, why not during the intermediate state we call sleep? You ever wake up but can't move? Sleep paralysis. If you've experienced it, you know it's not quite dreaming and not quite waking. You open your eyes, but your body is locked, and often, distressingly often, you sense a presence in the room. Something watching, something malevolent. The scientific explanation is straightforward. During REM sleep, your body is paralyzed to prevent you from acting out dreams. Sometimes consciousness wakes up before the paralysis lifts. The sense of presence, the shadow figures, the feeling of something sitting on your chest. These are hallucinations generated by a brain trying to make sense of contradictory sensory input. But here's what sleep laboratory studies reveal. During sleep paralysis, your brain shows predominant theta wave activity, the signature of dreaming, not the alpha and beta waves of wakefulness, which means scientifically, you're not awake. You're dreaming that you're awake. You're in a false awakening state with muscle paralysis, which raises a question the researchers don't want to ask. If you're dreaming that you're awake and lying paralyzed in your bed, and in that dream there's a presence watching you, is it a hallucination? Or are you briefly conscious in a timeline where those presences are real? Where consciousness isn't confined to individual bodies, but exists in forms we don't have names for? Every culture on Earth has folklore about entities that visit sleepers. The incubus and succubus of medieval Europe, the night hag, the old hag syndrome reported across Newfoundland, the shadow people described by modern experiencers. Different cultures, different time periods, remarkably consistent phenomenology. Either these are archetypal images emerging from a collective unconscious, or consciousness during these hybrid sleep states is briefly accessing a reality layer where these entities actually exist. I'm not arguing for demons. I'm arguing that consciousness might be far less confined than we assume. And sleep might be when we temporarily perceive aspects of reality normally filtered out by waking consciousness. Maybe these entities, these shadows at the edge of sleep, aren't visitors at all. Maybe they're echoes of ourselves. Because what if consciousness doesn't end where your body does? What if the boundaries blur not only between waking and dreaming, but between bodies themselves? Here's what neurologists can't adequately explain. Phantom limb syndrome. Amputees feel sensations in limbs that no longer exist. They can move phantom fingers, feel phantom pain, experience phantom itches. The prevailing theory involves neural remapping and historical body maps stored in the somatosensory cortex. But some amputees report something stranger. They describe feeling limbs they never had, extra arms, tails, wings. As if the neural body map their consciousness expects doesn't quite match the body they actually occupy. There are documented cases of young children with no possible exposure who describe past lives in extraordinary detail. Names, locations, relationships that later prove historically accurate. Researchers like Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia have compiled thousands of cases. The conventional explanation involves either fraud, coincidence, or unconscious exposure to information. But some cases resist those explanations. Children describing locations they couldn't have known, using languages they were never taught. What if consciousness isn't generated by the brain, but filtered through it? What if your sense of self isn't confined to this particular body, this particular timeline, but represents one expression of a consciousness that exists across multiple versions simultaneously? What if dreams are moments when that filter weakens? When you briefly remember other bodies, other lives, other timelines where versions of you made different choices and lived different stories? The lamp man didn't dream a life. He remembered one. A life his consciousness lived in another timeline. And when his consciousness in that timeline experienced trauma, the equivalent of a blow to the head that knocked him unconscious, his awareness briefly synced between timelines. The 7 minutes he spent unconscious on a sidewalk corresponded to 10 years lived elsewhere. And when the connection broke, he retained memories of both lives. That's not dreaming. That's consciousness existing non-locally across multiple realities, briefly becoming aware of its own multiplicity. What if dreams aren't escapes, but returns? Every night, as your body falls away, as your breathing slows and your brain begins to hum with theta waves, something ancient stirs. You don't disappear, you shift into a different configuration of the same consciousness. Another branch of you that kept living when this one went still. And maybe that's why some dreams feel like memories. Why some people we meet for the first time feel like déjà vu. Why grief can echo for lives we never lived. Because somewhere, you did. The lamp man didn't just dream. He glimpsed the mechanism, the fracture where consciousness folds through itself, remembering what it usually forgets. Neuroscientists call it an error. Physicists call it decoherence. Mystics call it awakening. But maybe it's all the same event, consciousness catching itself in the act of existing across worlds. Think about it. When you sleep, your mind constructs entire realities. Whole worlds, not imagined, experienced. You feel texture, warmth, pain, love. You taste coffee that doesn't exist here. You remember lives that never happened, until you wake and they dissolve like smoke. But if consciousness truly transcends time and locality, maybe nothing dissolves at all. Maybe every version of you, the one that died, the one that lived, the one still dreaming, continues somewhere. And the only reason we can't hold them all at once is because the human mind was never meant to carry infinity. So it filters, compresses, pretends there's only one. But the truth has been whispering in your dreams all along. You are not a body having dreams. You are a dream having bodies. And when you finally close your eyes for the last time, you won't end. You'll simply wake up somewhere else.